This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello everyone, my guest today is a teacher, educator, poet and singer from Buenos Aires, Argentina, Claudia Ferradas. And among other things, we will be talking about literature for intercultural awareness and mediation in the classroom.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello everyone, you're listening to the Twilight Show on Saturday the 18th of May. My name is Graham Stanley, broadcasting live from Mexico City. And today's guest, very special guest, is Dr. Claudia Ferradas, who is a teacher educator with NILE, that's the Norwich Institute for Language Education in the UK. And Claudia has worked in more than 20 countries and has been encouraging the use of literature and the arts in language teaching in particular. She's also published poetry collections in English and Spanish, and she is a podcaster and a singer. And I will be talking to Claudia, as I said earlier, about literature for intercultural awareness and mediation in the classroom, among other things, after the Teachers Talk Radio news.
Reading Solutions UK. Are you looking for best practices and innovative strategies to foster confident, lifelong readers? Join the free online International Reading Conference on the 11th, 12th and 13th of June. Hear from speakers like TV personality and education expert Basit Siddiqui, beloved children's author Michael Rosen, fluency expert Tim Rosinski, EEF specialist Chloe Butlin, the National Literacy Trust's Irene Picton, and a range of experienced practitioners, including MAT leaders, deputy heads, heads of English, high-level teaching assistants, and school librarians. Through the 3-day conference, speakers will explore a range of topics at the forefront of the current educational landscape, with sessions relevant for all educators and key stages. Visit Reading Solutions at readingsolutionsuk.co.uk for more information and to sign up for this free conference.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC reports on proposed changes to sex and relationship education guidance for schools in England. According to the report on the news website, government sources have told the BBC about the plans, which include banning sex education for under 9s, as well as additional guidance for teaching about gender identity. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said the new guidance would ensure children were not exposed to disturbing content. Teachers have responded with concerns that some of the guidance appears contradictory and say there is no evidence of a widespread problem with current guidance. The new plans say secondary school pupils will learn about protected characteristics such as sexual orientation and gender reassignment, but makes it clear that schools should not teach about the concept of gender identity. It said it was right to take a cautious approach. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan, speaking on BBC Breakfast, said biological sex is the basis of relationship, sex and health education, not these contested views. ASCL's General Secretary said that it was important that banning the teaching of gender identity did not shut down discussion, and that young people must be able to discuss this without their teachers feeling in peril of saying something wrong. The new guidance also strengthens rules to make it easier for parents to access teaching materials to see what their children are learning, although many point out that this guidance is currently in place. Lucy Emerson of the Sex Education Forum said, "If topics were to be restricted, it will leave children even more dependent on getting answers from online sources." The draft guidance is now open to a 9-week consultation, but once finalised, will be statutory. An outline of the proposed new age restrictions can be found on the BBC News website and the consultation on the Department for Education website. In the United States, pro-Palestinian protests at colleges and universities have made the news again, as some graduates from Duke University in North Carolina staged a walkout. The protest came just prior to a speech by veteran comedian Jerry Seinfeld, who was due to receive an honorary degree. Mr. Seinfeld has been a vocal supporter of Israel since the 7th of October attacks by Hamas. Some students stayed to hear the speech, but videos posted on social media also showed some booing and chanting slogans in support of Palestine. Whilst the ceremony at Duke went ahead, plans at other universities, including Columbia and the University of Southern California, have cancelled or restructured their main graduation ceremonies to avoid further complications. The Daily Mirror features comments from Strictly Judge Shirley Ballas about free school meals. She focuses on her own experiences of being raised by a single mother and says she understands what increasing numbers of British children living in poverty are going through. She recalls looking forward to her free school meal, referring to it as a nice lunch every day. At 63, Ms. Ballas is hoping to use her experiences to highlight the issue of poverty by being part of an ITV documentary called Kids in Poverty. According to the Mirror, 4.3 million children in Britain get their only meal a day at school. 30% of UK children are living below the poverty line, with 1 million classed as being in extreme poverty. Figures from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation say that the share of children living in absolute poverty has increased by 148% since 2017 and is at its highest level for 30 years. The documentary can be seen on demand, and full details of the article from the Mirror are on its website. Finally, students at Lancaster University have voted for all food served on campus to be plant-based, according to BBC Radio Lancashire. The Students' Union is supporting the gradual transition to 100% vegan menus, with a target of 50% by 2025 and 100% by 2027. A campaigner told the BBC that Lancaster University has a goal of net zero by 2035 and that implementing a plant-based catering system aligns with this goal. The Countryside Alliance said too few students had been involved in the decision, with 18 of the 19 delegates on the Students' Union Council, who do represent 13,000 students, voting to support the motion. But the Countryside Alliance called it an attack on freedom of choice and said the decision should have been put to a wider student vote. Universities including Stirling, Warwick and Newcastle have also voted to go plant-based, although Edinburgh rejected the plan. The votes have been organised following Animal Rising's Plant-Based Universities campaign. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Hello and welcome back, everyone. My guest today is Claudia Ferradas, as I mentioned in the introduction. Hello, Claudia. How are you?
Hello, Graham. Lovely to be in your program, and I'm thrilled really that you've invited me. Thank you very much, and hello to everybody at the other end.
The thrill and the honour is definitely mine. Claudia, what have you been up to recently?
Oh, quite a lot. As a matter of fact, I've been doing poetry and singing shows in cafes in Buenos Aires, where I live. And I just couldn't believe that we sold out on every occasion. So I'm preparing a new one now with a piano player I really like. So I'm really excited about the possibility of doing this again in late June.
That's fantastic. I hope one day to be able to get over to Buenos Aires to see you do this live. I would love to be at one of the shows. Could you tell me how you or tell us all how you got involved in this? Has it always been something that you've done, or is it a recent development?
It is a rather recent development for the obvious reason that I had no time for it before. I mean, as a matter of fact, I always wanted to be a teacher, but I wanted to be a teacher of literature/philosophy. And then when I was about to start college, they were very difficult times in my country. And my dad, who worked for the University of Buenos Aires, where I wanted to study philosophy, warned me that things were going to get tough, and politically, I mean. And so he said, why don't you do something less risky? Because, you know, the philosophy and literature college is particularly vulnerable to police attacks, etc. And so, well, you know, I was 17. I listened to my dad, and I started the teacher training college to become a teacher of English, with a bit of frustration, because what I wanted to do was write and sing. And I don't see any incompatibility, but I had no time for my passions, except that English teaching became another passion. So that was great. And when I finally retired from a full-time job at college, at the very college where I studied, I said, well, maybe now it's time to do what I've always wanted to do, with all the experience and the bilingualism I developed over these years. So that's it. I started going to singing classes again, something I'd done as a child for many years. And I started writing songs, and I started publishing my poetry. So it's like starting a whole new life. It's a bit of a loop going back to when I was 17.
That's fantastic. And so you became an English teacher, but why was it English teaching that attracted to you, or teaching in general? Was it because your parents were in education, or was it something that or was there another reason for it?
There was another reason. When I was only 7 years old, I was fascinated by my school teacher. She really inspired me. And then she was our teacher again the next year. So those 2 years of my life have become unforgettable. I still remember the way she dressed, the way she came into the classroom, the way she spoke to us. Imagine, this was decades ago. And this teacher would have us write with one hand, in my case, my right hand, 1 week, with the left hand the next week. Because she said, well, you know, one day you may have a problem with your hand may hurt, and you may need to use your other hand. But in fact, she told our parents that there was research that pointed in the direction of, you know, activating both sides of the brain. Imagine, this was like, what, 60 years ago? No, not so much, but 50. And she was really someone who was ready to experiment and inspire, and a great communicator. So I wanted to be her, basically. And I was an only child, and I would play with invisible friends, imaginary friends, and they would be sitting in my classroom. And that's what I would do. I would repeat the lesson she gave us, you know, word for word. Probably that's how I learned it so well, because I wanted to be her when I was back at home. And I still remember that with my old mates. We meet every 6 months or so, and we remember her. So imagine how inspiring she was. And so I always wanted to be a teacher because of her. Now, I became an English teacher simply because I love languages. 7 languages were spoken at home. English was not one of them. So I learned it to add an 8th language. So plurilingualism has always been something I felt comfortable with.
And so what languages were spoken at home then, if English wasn't one of them?
My grandparents, my mother's parents, were escaping from war in Europe. And my granny was Austrian. My grandfather was Ukrainian. And they spoke their native tongues, of course. And they spoke Russian as well, because my grandfather had been a prisoner in Russia for some time. They spoke Polish, because that's where they ended up on the way to Argentina, in Poland. And they spoke Hebrew and Yiddish. They my grandfather learned Lithuanian because there was a Lithuanian priest around the corner and he wanted to play cards with him. So he learned Lithuanian. You know, they learned languages very easily. And so I grew up in Babel, basically. And they spoke all those languages completely mixed up, which is probably the reason why I cannot speak any in particular. German, of course, was a kind of lingua franca as well. And my father was of Spanish descent. So he only spoke Spanish. And
Wow.
nobody spoke English except for mom, who had been to English classes at secondary school. So they thought English would be my lingua franca, and they were right.
That's funny. And so was it at school that you first started learning and speaking English?
No, I took private classes with a teacher in the area, which was quite typical in my generation. And she was not particularly good at it. I mean, she was inspiring as a teacher, definitely, but her English was not very good. And so I acquired some habits I had to unlearn and relearn. But as I was not planning to make a career out of that, I didn't worry too much until I decided I would go into teacher training college. So I had to start taking classes to unlearn my mistakes in pronunciation and whatnot. And my teacher was wonderful because instead of using a textbook or anything, she used short stories. So she knew I
Oh,
was
wow.
passionate about literature, and she was so good as a teacher. You see, I've been very lucky to have inspiring teachers, really. She taught me English through stories, and that's how I got into teacher training college, and the rest is history.
Amazing. And did you start working in a school? What age group and levels did you start teaching?
I opened a language school with a colleague, Laura Renard, and we had all age groups. I taught children for a couple of years, but then I love teaching teenagers and adults, and that's what I did the rest of my life.
And then you moved into teacher training, is that right?
Almost immediately after graduating, one of my teachers at Teacher Training College asked for a leave of absence, and they asked me to replace her. So, and I never left. So the college where I studied was my workplace, apart from my private language school, for 35 years. And I ended up retiring as academic secretary in charge of research and you know, a number of responsibilities. So basically all my academic career, my teacher training career was at that college where I taught future teachers and future translators as well. But I always taught them literature, which was a way of having, you know, all my passions convert into a single job.
Wonderful. And what about, do you remember the first time you did any teacher training outside of Argentina?
Yeah, let me think. Well, my first seminars and teacher training events were in Argentina. I've been to every single province or state, if you like, of Argentina as a teacher trainer. But outside Argentina, I can't remember which my first one was, but it must have been Uruguay or one of the Latin American countries. Then I went to Brazil several times, Chile, Paraguay. Yeah, those were the early years. And then Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador. Yeah.
So, first of all, you traveled all across Argentina teacher training, and then all across the Americas teacher training. And then where did you cross the pond, if you like?
I don't know if it was in that order, but I do remember being in the American continent first, including the United States and Canada. So yeah, and then I started studying for my master's degree in England at the Norwich Institute for Language Education, a joint program with the University of East Anglia. And as I had a family and a job here, I couldn't just stay there. So I did one module, came back to Argentina, another module, came back to Argentina. Those were the days when we didn't have online, possibilities as much as we do now, even though email was important. And when I got my postgrad diploma, even before the master's, Dave Allen, our director, asked me to do some work for them. So I started working in the summer in England for Nile, and this year it's going to be my 25th anniversary working as a trainer there. So if I had an academic home on this side of the Atlantic, then Nile became my academic home on the other side.
Right. And apart from the singing and poetry that you're doing at the moment, are you still teaching or teacher training as well, apart from the work that you're doing from Nile?
Well, I do my work for Nile, as you say, every summer, a couple of months there. And I do reading group coordination, online. I used to have groups at home, and that was my absolute passion, to teach whatever text we wanted to deal with, particularly contemporary texts. And then the pandemic hit, as we know, and there was lockdown. And that was magic because it opened up the possibility of having people from all over the world. So just last week, we had people from Israel, Tanzania, Spain, Portugal, and some Latin American countries as well, and Argentina, meeting to discuss books. And that is my job at the moment, because there were more than 70 people. So I've subdivided them into 6 groups. And it's almost a full-time job now, just preparing that and getting the books ready and preparing the activities on the PowerPoint. And it's a whole new way of experimenting with online teaching as well. Though it's more coordinating, facilitating than teaching, if there's any limit between the two. And what I feel is that languages, which have always been my medium and my challenge, really allow me to find this convergence. There's literature, there's language learning, there's reflection on identity. And as a matter of fact, I wrote a poem about that experience I told you about. My dad telling me, look, these are dangerous times, be careful what you decide to do, because you may end up disappearing, basically, which is what happened to so many people in my country, sadly. And I wrote a poem called Digging, probably because I had Seamus Heaney's poem at the back of my head, I don't know. And the funny thing, Graham, is that I wrote about an experience which actually happened in my life. And it happened in 1975. And I wrote about it in 2015. 2005. Yeah. In France. And I wrote it in English. So how languages can sometimes be at the same time a medium, a vehicle, and a mask. Because I could never bring myself down to write about a painful experience like that in Spanish, in my own mother tongue. It hurt too much. But I was able to write it in my chosen language, which is English.
That's amazing. Claudia, if you would like to read that poem or any other poem today, I would love to hear it. I'm sure our listeners would as well.
Okay, it's in my first poetry collection. It's called Digging, as I said. It's in 2 parts. Part 1. Bring me those books, my father said, gasping for breath and leaning on his shovel, his forehead crowned with thorny beads of sweat, unwilling executioner about to lift his axe. So one by one, glossy covers, leather-bound volumes, yellowish pages bookmarked with a dry rose, all found their way into the common grave. No words of mourning, no ritual of farewell, as he shoveled the dark earth back on top at the back of our garden, where the red swings of childhood used to be. Hard times are coming, kid, I heard him say. And they did come, indeed. Times when names would be erased from my address book and people would go missing like those words consumed by bookworms more curious than myself. Part 2. I never dared to ask him if he knew of that one volume I smuggled into school to read aloud to avid teenage ears, to share the thoughts we were told not to think. A vocation discovered, a loss of innocence I kept all to myself. It's on the same shelf still, safely wedged among those that have replaced the ones that lie under the new pine tree. As I teach, as I learn, as I read, I hear that shovel scrape the dry, thick earth, but feel a lighter weight under your cross. Dad, I'm still reading it.
Oh, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that, Claudia. So you wrote about a moment that actually happened when you had to get rid of books, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was because the danger of actually being caught with certain types of information of books was very real at that time.
Absolutely.
And it obviously left a vivid memory on you, and the need to actually revisit that time.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an open wound in my country in every respect. In my case, it was just, and I put that word just between inverted commas, books. In other cases, there were lives.
Yeah.
And in my case, I know that my dad buried those books because he was aware, working at the University of Buenos Aires as he did, that harder times were coming. And there were already threats. This was 1975, before the dictatorship. Because there was an extreme right group that threatened people. And I was a real fan of some writers who were included into prohibition lists. And this was the reason. But I did smuggle one book by Cortázar. That was the book that I took to school. And I do think my dad knew about that book, but he wouldn't say, give it to me and let me bury it. Together with the others. I think he had the hope of recovering those books later on, but it took years, and yeah, I mean, they would have been, too dirty and impossible to recover. So he planted a pine tree on top.
Oh, wow. That's an amazing story.
Yeah, unfortunately, a true story. But as I say, I want to write it in English, and it's a poem I haven't translated. I can't try even, because I don't think I would be able to read it out loud in Spanish. It brings back the memory of that very clear day in my mind, and my father's voice, because by saying hard times are coming, kid, he was saying change your choice of studies as well. It marked my future in a definite way. I think you would be happy to know that I've managed to cover that loop and get all those passions to converge in some way or another.
Yes, I'm sure. And that idea of literature being related, or being a way of dealing with memories of life, and also this idea of literature for intercultural awareness and mediation that we talked about being the main topic of today. Could you talk a little bit more about that? What is literature for you, and how does it relate to intercultural awareness and mediation?
Well, probably I got started with that simply because of my passion for literature, because I liked it and I tried it out in the classroom, as we teachers tend to do with something we're really enthusiastic about, and then it worked. And I noticed, as I experimented more and more, that even though there's this prejudice that literature, and poetry in particular, can be obscure, can be difficult, and it can be, we know it can be, but it's also a question of choosing, as we do with everything else, whatever we need for the particular purpose we're trying to attain. So very often I would bring poems into the classroom that students did not even notice that they were poems, in the sense that they were, I don't know, a couple of sentences turned into verses by a skillful writer like, say, Roger McGough or Brian Bilston. And the fact that they were short, fun, that they had a kind of punchline that was memorable. As Brian Tomlinson says, a poem a day will keep boredom away, or something like that. When he opens his sessions at every level with a poem. I didn't do that in every class, but I noticed more and more that there's something about the expressive function of language in poetic texts, or in literature in general, the creativity in it, that that raises a kind of interest that other texts do not. So very often, if I was dealing with, say, an informative text, I would bring something connected with that topic or with something in the text that was more creative, more literary, more adventurous, if you like. And I have an anecdote which inspired me as a very young teacher. I was teaching a group of medical doctors in an intensive care unit. So they were really stressed out, as you can imagine, and they were always ready to leave the classroom and rush to the intensive care unit. So I noticed they wanted training for their conferences and that sort of thing. So I was working with medical texts, as you would. It was ESP, basically, or if you like, academic writing, specific purposes. And one day, the head of the unit rushed into the classroom and said, "Ita is dead." And I thought, oh my God, is he coming to say that a patient has died like that? And the others were taking it so kind of lightly and even laughing. I thought, what's going on here? Well, Ita was not a patient. No, that would have been unprofessional of them. It was a character in a soap opera that we were all watching at the time. It was a very popular soap. And I just couldn't believe my ears. Here was the head of an intensive care unit, so professional, so formal, suddenly talking about a character in a soap. And the reason for that was that they were watching the soap while they were waiting, while they were on duty. And this girl in the soap was ill, and they disagreed completely on the way the illness was portrayed in the soap. So they had a medical reason to watch those episodes. And they were all chatting in English about what happened to Ita, how the writer of the soap had written about it. And I thought, oh, so they want to talk about medical issues, but not necessarily through a technical text they can handle so well. And I started introducing bits and pieces of novels that talked about medical issues and hospitals and whatnot. And it meant such a sea change in their relationship to me and to English. So that was an anecdote, totally by chance, that taught me that probably all I had learned about what to select for an ESP classroom was not exactly all there was to be said about it. And so that, as regards literature as a motivator, as something that can, take you outside the box of what you think your class should be about. But another thing that I noticed more and more was that the more literary texts I brought into the classroom from different countries, say countries in Africa that had been part of the British Empire, to give an example, the more interested my students became in the culture that was being portrayed in those books. So as we know that English is the language in which so many people express themselves, including yours truly, writing a poem about myself in English, I thought, there's something here. And that's what I based my PhD research on. I tried to recover texts about Argentina written in English, because I felt that, it was great to bring, I don't know, Chimamanda Adichie, for example, into the classroom, fantastic. But then what about us? And that is also based on an anecdote I had. I was studying at Nile in England, first day of classes in my master's program. And all my mates were from Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, and Argentina. Those were the days when we could afford it. And they were drinking our regional drink, mate, which we pass, on from hand to hand, and we drink out of a metal straw. And there was a lady from Saudi Arabia in the group, poor thing, feeling totally different from the rest. And she saw me queuing at the coffee machine. So she went up to me and said, "Claudia, how is it that you managed not to become addicted to the drug that the others are having?" And I said, "Well, it's not a drug, but it is addictive. And it's just that I don't like it." And so I tried to explain to her, as I've just done, what mate is. And I started gesticulating and trying to find the words, because you know what? I'd never done it. I'd never used that explanation before. simply because I learned my English with other Argentinians. And there was no need at all to speak about ourselves and our culture in English. But the minute you got away from the classroom, you did. You needed your language to speak about yourself. And if your language was not the language of communication, you needed English as a lingua franca or whatever. And so I thought, oh dear, I've been teaching literature. I've been using Shakespeare in the classroom, but I cannot explain what a mate is without embarrassing myself. So that started changing my way of looking at course books, what they provided and what they failed to provide. And so going back to my PhD research, I tried to recover books that were totally forgotten, written about Argentina, that would give me the language I needed to talk about myself. And I got a British Council scholarship for that. And I started doing research into the life and works of William Henry Hudson, Cunningham Graham, and other great men who had been born in Argentina or and they spoke English at home, or who had visited Argentina. And I picked up more than 120 titles. Wow. And I noticed I could develop materials on that. But to be honest, Graham, I haven't been very successful in getting publishers interested in producing a reader on Latin American stories, whereas
That's
you
a shame.
get them on Africa or Asia. We produce our own, handmade materials. That's fine. But I noticed that empowered our students to find the strategies and the vocabulary as well to talk about themselves.
Should maybe look into self-publishing, Claudia, if there's...
Well, yeah, we've just published with the Hudson Museum. They found Hudson's old house and they turned it into a museum. And the museum helped us publish a resource book, which is freely available online, which is partially in Spanish, but it's got some units in English for the English classroom. And it's being used in public schools in the area where the museum is. And teachers can just print out whatever worksheets they are interested in. And there's a lot on nature, because after all, he was the one who systematized the birds of the pampas of the flatlands of Argentina, and some of the birds have even got his name. That's why in Hyde Park in London there's a monument in his honor by the Royal Society of Birds. So there's a whole section written by the museologist on nature and conservation, a whole section on art and how the arts can be related to Hudson's texts in Spanish, because he's been widely translated. And then 5 units that I wrote with my colleague Griselda Beacon for primary and secondary schools on how we can integrate both the novels in Spanish and the novels in English, and how in many ways being bilingual and, if you like, bicultural, Hudson gives us the tools we need.
Wow, that's really interesting.
At Bloomsbury Education, we're passionate about supporting teachers with high-quality professional development books from leading experts. Whether you're navigating your first crucial years as an early career teacher, or a more experienced teacher looking to refresh your practice or take a step up into leadership, our award-winning books are here to help. We publish practical books to support teaching across primary and secondary, from the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design. Visit the Bloomsbury Education website at bloomsbury.com/education to find out more, and use code BLOOMTTR24 to save 20% on all education titles. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
I've always considered myself to be a caring head teacher who acts sensitively to support staff mental health. But what I found increasingly difficult was managing the negative impact on staff mental health when resolving issues related to their employment or daily work. Heartfelt Leadership has been developed by Teachwell Toolkit as a handbook to support head teachers to overcome the challenges of school improvement while supporting staff well-being. We know that difficult conversations can quickly turn into conflict if procedures are not fully transparent, understood and followed. Our handbook takes you through step-by-step processes while maintaining mutual respect, avoiding conflict, and finding solutions.
I think it's so interesting to think, in my experience as well. I think I studied history, and I think one of the interesting things you learn when you study history is that a lot of the most interesting or most insightful works of historians, or historians that are not from the country that they're writing about, that if you have a historian being able to look at the events and interpret them who isn't from the area or from the country, it becomes a lot more sort of valuable in a lot of ways. Definitely in some contexts. So, for example, the Spanish Civil War, the historian Paul Preston, who's from the UK, is one of the leading sort of historians about the Spanish Civil War. And one of the reasons why is because there's too much invested in Spain for a Spanish historian to actually look at things objectively with all of the personal and family history. I think it would get in the way, wouldn't it?
Yeah, sure. It's a matter of perspective there and distancing, which is so important. Probably language does provide that distancing, and that answers my question about why I chose English to write about, my dad burying the books. Probably that allowed me a little bit of distance. And then there are great writers like Samuel Beckett, who wrote his own works in French and then translated them into English because he needed that distancing. To look at language as an object you can manipulate in a different way from the emotional, kind of straightforward, intuitive way in which you do it in your mother tongue. It's fascinating, isn't it? And as we get more and more global, more and more multilingual literature is developing, where writers don't bother to translate or even gloss within the text something that they are writing in another language or languages. And this is particularly evident, I've noticed, in the German-speaking countries for some reason. And I've become fascinated with that because I think it's a great opportunity for mediation. I mean, I know that the concept of mediation has become very popular, a very sexy word in the field since it was, highlighted in the Common European Framework. And there's a bit of an obsession I've noticed in Spain with everything being systematized around the notion of mediation. I think we've always tried to be mediators in our classrooms. To begin with, we're didactically speaking mediators. I mean, pedagogy is a mediation activity. You find the way to make something difficult or unknown, known and understandable. So we are mediators, as interpreters and translators are. But the fact that there's now a focus on 54 new descriptions in the Common European Framework, 54, to assess mediation, and everybody is a bit paranoid about assessing mediation. I think literature, again, or the creative arts, not only literature, and even a video on TikTok can be a great opportunity to mediate, to learn how a message is carried across to reach cultures which are not your own, and how that is decoded by someone who has a very different view of things. I remember, for example, doing wonderful poems for middle school by Tony Mitten, where there were dragons. And my Chinese students saying, no, I could never take this into the classroom because the dragon here is monstrous. And a dragon for me can never be monstrous. And so the question that opens up is, all right, how can you mediate this without offending the other? How can you say, right, are you going to then omit my culture, sweep it under the carpet, say, I'm not talking about dragons? Or are you going to say, let's see how differently people can see the same thing, and how can you find something in common? Last year, I was teaching at Nile a group of absolutely fantastic Uzbek teacher trainers who had come for a course. And they came back from the National Gallery in London, which they had visited during the weekend. And on Monday, they were, bubbling with excitement about all they had seen. So, of course, as a teacher, I tried to respond to that excitement. And I brought the Titian painting, which cost so many £1 million, and we talked about Ovid's Metamorphoses, how the painting is based on an old story, how the arts can tell a story, etc., etc. And they did all the wonderful work I asked them to do. And then $1 million question at the end of the class, all right, how would you, colleagues, bring this into your classroom? And the answer was, I wouldn't. And there you say, oh my God, what have I done wrong? I had done everything wrong, because basically I had chosen a painting where there are nymphs, and these nymphs are nude. And I couldn't even notice that nudity, because for me, from my Occidental culture glasses, that was art, and that was the obvious way in which Titian would have painted the nymphs in the Renaissance. And they said, no, that would be offensive to my students in class. And so my question, again, like with the dragon, was, right, and how did you enjoy the National Gallery then? And then they said, well, we chose what pictures to look at. And I say, fine, but you had a choice. And so having noticed that in spite of my long experience in intercultural teaching, I had once again put my foot into it, simply because my culture was stronger than my vision. I said, all right, now for tomorrow, can you prepare a presentation on what you would teach and why you would teach it that way? And I attended that class. I sat there as a student and I learned so much. So sometimes a mistake can also be intercultural, and it can be an opportunity for mediation.
Wow, that's such a wonderful anecdote, Claudia. Do you think that intercultural awareness should be more prominent in language teaching or language teacher training?
It's always been central. And I don't think we can talk about mediation without focusing on cultural mediation, among other forms of mediation. Of course, linguistic mediation comes first. Without some kind of language with which you can communicate, well, there will be no mediation whatsoever. But I think that culture is there all the time. And when I mean culture, I'm not only talking about exotic anecdotes like, for me, the culture of these Uzbek colleagues or the Chinese colleagues may be quite foreign, quite different. And they don't seem to know the first thing about the place where I come from. So it's a great opportunity for mediation and mutual learning. But I'm not only talking about that. In every classroom, we find enormous differences that we can call cultural in the sense of religion, background, habits, etc. And we notice that when we get embarrassed sitting at table with our next door neighbor, for example. Even in our own families, we have constant misunderstandings. I remember using a poem by Brian Patton, which, if I'm not mistaken, is called Here Today, No Hair Tomorrow, something like that. And it's about someone who finds a hair on the bed, and it's a hair that does not correspond to his wife's color, hair color. And so, of course, it's a very elegant way of saying, have you been unfaithful to me, or something like that. And I've used it with adults, of course, and they loved it because there's so much being said between the lines that it is not really explicit. But what did I use it for? My objective was intonation. As you know, Spanish speakers find it very hard sometimes to imitate a certain pitch in English, certain tone that you reach. For example, when you say hair, the poem says, I found a hair. And the other person, husband or wife, answers, hair. And that intonation is really difficult for us to get. We would say something like un pelo, like that intonation. And they practiced that intonation through the poem, and they never forgot, because they found the poem funny. They found it repressed in its cultural way of expressing something that we Latin people would always be very explicit about. We would start shouting probably. And the intonation was never forgotten. Every time they had to do it, they went, yeah, they remember that and they got it. So my language objective, which was very narrow, if you like, intonation, was reached. But above all, they remembered the poem. It became much more memorable than any lesson about why you use a certain kind of intonation when you respond in surprise in English. So practical, yes. Inspiring, too. Did they read other poems by Brian Patton after that? You bet. So I insist, you never know where literature is going to take you in the classroom.
Yes, that's a very good example of how poems can be used for all sorts of different things, and in particular, pronunciation and intercultural kind of awareness. Are there any other poets or poems that you always find you go back to because of that?
Roger McGough in every respect and for every age group. Then Brian Patton himself, same reason. So the Liverpool poets seem to produce a lot of, useful materials. And now, well, nothing particular off the top of my head, but Brian Bilston, who is so generous, providing lots of materials, online. And I understand he closed IATEFL this year. As a matter of fact, I remember when I closed IATEFL, I did the closing plenary in Cardiff back in 2009. I remember I was told we would like to start a tradition of doing something poetic, something different in the final plenary, and I sang a tango.
Oh,
I
wow.
sang Cafetín de Buenos Aires for intercultural awareness. I sang it, but there was a translation on screen while I was singing it. And it was precisely to deconstruct this idea that the texts in the course book are all you need. Because most people would have thought being born and bred in Buenos Aires, you dance the tango and you sing the tango and the tango represents you. And I do sing the tango, I don't dance it. But that tango, like so many others, is so macho that it would never represent me. And that's part of what I wanted to show, how using a song as a poetic text could also throw light upon my own cultures, in the plural, how cultures sometimes clash within my own context. And how would I explain that in English to someone abroad? So suddenly, this poem set to music in a tango was also a useful poem, and it was in my mother tongue. So I don't think there's just a set of poems that we could stick to. And someone who really changed my life professionally in this respect was John McGray, with his book Literature with a Small L, published as far back as 1991. And then it was a bit of a miracle that he became my PhD supervisor. And if you go to Literature with a Small L, what he's saying is even graffiti on the walls can be a useful, poetic, creative text.
Wow, yeah. And to go back to what you were saying about the lyrics of that tango being macho, what do you think about the focus that seems to have become even more heightened recently about texts and how they are a lot of texts written in the past have become most banned or to be avoided because of what they represent, either it being how they represent men and women or different cultures, race, etc., and whether or not we should avoid those texts or whether we should look at them as being reflective of the time that they were written. Do you have a particular opinion on
I've
that
got a very
when it comes
strong
to
opinion in that respect, Graham. I just hate cancellation, policies. To think that Margaret Atwood can't be read in Florida, for example, is outrageous.
I
And
didn't know that. How come?
She's on the forbidden list.
But why in particular Margaret
Because
Atwood?
of The Handmaid's Tale, and its attack on religion. I don't want to say something wrong. We would have to double check that. But
Sure.
I heard a recent interview on her latest book and at Harvard, and the interviewer asks her about The Handmaid's Tale, and she jokes about it and says, "Well, thank God we're not in Florida. We are doing this because we're not in Florida." So I know that she herself is saying that. Now, I haven't seen the documents justifying this, so I don't want to say something wrong. But I mean, I think that is underestimating the reader and the teacher and the students. I think that any text is a valuable text, provided you approach it critically. provided there's the possibility of debating the ideas in that text and contextualization. I need to know when it was written, under what circumstances, and then, yes, compare the context of production, the context of writing, and the context of reception, which will be different. I mean, am I not going to talk about the Inquisition because I find it horrifying? No, I need to know it existed. I need to acknowledge it and then be critical and say, never again, please. But unless I learned that that existed, I run the danger, which I think we are running, of repeating the story. Precisely because I'm unaware and I'm, starting from square one again. So I think it's really important to come into contact with texts that we will strongly disagree with. And I'm also worried, very worried, about teachers who are not allowed to express their own views, particularly in literature and history classes. It's true that you run the risk, because you're in a position of power, of influencing your students. That is a fact. But then it's a matter of ensuring that there's critical debate, even of the teacher's views. That can be ensured. But I think it's really risky that we have become so neutral, inverted commas, please, that then we practically cannot choose anything at all, because there's sex in it, or because it can be offensive to any particular minority. If it is offensive, let's discuss why it's offensive and then make sure it does not offend. So the challenge there, once again, is mediation, pedagogic and cultural.
Yes, I definitely agree with you. I think it's important. I think a lot depends on, as you say, the text that you choose to bring to the classroom and how you present them and what you use them for.
What do you use them for? And never forget, if your objective is to teach the present perfect, the present perfect is still there. I'm not advocating, but sometimes they tell me, it's a kind of very holistic and relaxed approach, but then they never learn. No, I'm not forgetting structure. I'm not forgetting grammar. But what I'm saying is, do not sacrifice the text for the grammatical purpose. Incidentally, then you can teach why the present perfect was used rather than the simple past, for example. There's a poem by Brian Patton called Dear Mum, which I've used a lot for the passive voice, but they don't even notice I'm using it for the passive voice, because this is a child who's done a lot of wrong things. He's made a mess of the house in his mum's absence, and he ends up saying, and knowing that you would be mad at me or something like that, I've gone over to Gran's for a bit. And it's all trying to express what he's done without acknowledging that he did it. So what is better than that, to use the passive voice? So we play a lot with the structures that the kid uses and the way we could express it differently. But the fun of the poem comes first. And then you say, all right, why is this structure used rather than any other? So it's language awareness developed out of a poem. Have we digressed? No.
Yes, I think that's so important, isn't it? The idea of being exposed to something that has an effect on you beyond the language, and then looking at the language to explore what is it about the way that something has been written that produces that effect.
Exactly.
It very, very clearly can give students an idea of how they can use language, hopefully, to produce a similar kind of effect.
Yep, hopefully, yep. But it's a process, it's a slow process. And it's true, some texts will not create a great effect on certain students, others will. And then probably the one that you thought was not tremendously inspiring will be. And that teaches you a lot about your students as well, which is also very good. Their responses will teach you more and more about who's in the classroom and what their likes and dislikes are. And then you can choose better and better.
And I imagine poetry lends itself very well to this type of work as well, because the words have been chosen very, very carefully. And absolutely, the texts are usually short enough that they lend themselves to be looked at and read time and time again by the students, for example.
Exactly. Sometimes you just use a poem, going back to Brian Tomlinson, as an anchor, just that, or a warmer. And sometimes you make it the main text or the text to relate to whatever other text you're dealing with, a listening, you name it. But when I say poetry or when I say literature, I'm talking again about John McGrath's idea of literature with a small L, not only the canon. Of course, if I can read Jane Austen and Shakespeare, that's fantastic, and I've done it as often as I could. But I don't need to go all the way into the classics to achieve this. What's more, they keep asking me, would you use a graded reader? And the answer is, why not? If that graded reader is adequate, I'm not going to say it's low-class literature. What's more, there's what we call language learning literature, that is authentic because it was created at a certain level, say A1 even. It's not an adapted text, but an original text written within the constraints of structure given by that level. And it's totally original. I'm thinking about the books by the late Philip Prowse, for example, which are fantastic at A1 level, or Antoinette Moses' books, which are truly literary, and yet they are written, which is a tremendous challenge, under the constraints of language that level for the reader demands. And if I want to do, for instance, now I'm teaching a series of webinars with an actress on The Tempest. Okay, not every reader can read The Tempest in the original. But am I going to say no to the story that The Tempest tells? So probably they need an adapted version. And then, yes, it's drama. We will watch performances. They will know what's happening. And I can select one or two fragments, one or two extracts from the original, and then focus on that. And I can do that with every classic. I can choose an adapted reader that I consider good for any reason, of, say, Wuthering Heights. And once they get interested in the story, yeah, I can go to the original, pick up a critical passage and study the way the original style works, etc. So if I'm going to wait until they are advanced enough, they may never know the books are there waiting for them to be discovered.
Yes. No, it's a good way in, isn't it? To use a simplified version to be able to look at the main points of a story, for example, and then to go back perhaps to sections of the original to then look at the way that the language is used in the original. And if they already understand the story or what is happening and the importance of the scenes, for example, then they can appreciate better the actual words used by the original author, for example.
In my experience, that's what happens, yes. And it's given me very successful lessons, to be honest. On the other hand, I've sometimes found myself getting carried away by something I like a lot. And they like a lot as well, but then I overdo it. You know, sometimes I feel it's working, they're interested, and then I kill the interest by doing more lessons than I should. You should leave them thirsty. You should leave them hungry,
Right.
wanting more to find out by themselves. I learned that as a younger teacher, that I was carried away, and I should at some point say, well, that's enough. Let's pass on to something else, and get them saying, no, we want more. Okay, you can find out, go to the library, do this, go to this internet page. But if not, you sort of exhaust it.
Yes, that's good advice, and it's good for promoting learner autonomy as well, isn't it? Really,
Absolutely.
Those students or teachers who are more interested will go and find out more for themselves, especially if you point them to where they can go.
Yeah, they need some scaffolding. Yeah, indeed, especially the younger ones. Yeah.
So, Claudia, if a teacher is listening now and they are perhaps a teacher of languages, and yet they've steered away from using literature, poetry, etc., in the classroom because they're a bit afraid of veering away from the textbook that they have, for example. How would you suggest they take the first steps? What would you say they should do if they wanted to gently introduce poetry or other literature into their classes?
Well, you can start with songs whose lyrics are truly poetry. Very often songs tell a story of some kind, And that is something that students are acquainted with, a narrative text. Take, for example, a classic, Piano Man, Billy Joel. It's not so narrative, it's more descriptive, but in some way it does tell a story. It describes a typical American piano bar, so it's full of cultural information. It's very 70s, so another reason to go back in time and find out about the decade and whatnot. For instance, how does it go? There's an old man sitting next to me making love to his tonic and gin. How much does that tell you about the old man? Once again, language awareness. It's an old song, teachers might say. It's not the sort of song they might listen to. But as Gustavo Gonzalez said in his interview in a previous program, sometimes it's a matter of opening up worlds they wouldn't know about otherwise. I'm always grateful when they show me something I had no idea of. Maybe I like it, maybe I don't, but maybe I want to go more deeply into it. So say you bring Piano Man into the classroom, a classic that is still on the radio, so they may have heard it. And you suddenly say, well, what do you know about this man? And the expression making love to his tonic and gin, they're normally quite shocked by it. Or they start giggling, which is great. What does that tell you about the guy's loneliness? What does this tell you about his relationship to drinking, etc.? And what you're doing is working with the in-betweenness of the lines of poetic texts. You're treating the song as a poem. And you're doing very deep levels of reading comprehension. And is that a poem? Oh, yes, it is. And then I've even published a chapter in one of the books that Brian Tomlinson edited on developing materials for language teaching on this song, on how you can go as far as you like with this song, get them to actually invent a life for each of these characters. What do they do in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening? How do they dress, etc., etc.? And then there's an old video of the song, a video clip, and they get shocked to see the characters, the casting that was carried out. So you've got to go a whole lesson plan that can end up in a role play, if you like, or in responses in writing. But you're dealing with poetry. You're dealing with language that expresses much more than it says at surface level. If you don't want to go into songs, you can go into any short poem by, say, Brian Bilston, or any of the poets I've mentioned before, Tony Mitten, if your students are younger, and work with it for playfulness. Don't turn it into an analysis. It's not a matter of doing literature as an object of study, not in this case. It's using it for fun, for pleasure, for aesthetic enjoyment. And then, yes, of course, language awareness and maybe cultural awareness too. And is there a poem in your own language that you would like to share with someone in English? And if so, how would you translate it? A mediation activity that used to be forbidden in the classroom, and that the framework now says it comes first. What we do first with the language is try to translate. So how about that? I've always started with song. Maybe that's a piece of advice I could share.
That's a great idea. To go back to that one line you quoted, it's even looking at why the songwriter chose to use tonic and gin rather than gin and tonic, and why exactly. That sounds strange to us.
He needs it for the meter, which is I normally start with the fill in the gaps for that song, the boring old-fashioned fill in the gaps, and the word love is blanked, making to his tonic and gin. And they don't find tonic and gin particularly unusual because they're not so used to the collocation, but that's fine. I'll go into that later. But that blank gives them a headache because you can do lots of things to
yes,
but make. And one of my students years ago came up with a suggestion, confessions, which I thought was brilliant, making confessions to his tonic and gin, which gives you the same idea of, talking to a glass because there's nobody else you can talk to. And that ended up with a very strong link between word and feeling, which became unforgettable. They never forgot that line. and the old man, and how the old man felt and how he looked, etc. And it was great because some of the girls, I remember, would say he was lonely, probably he had a wife and she had died, etc. They invented the soap, if you like. And the boys were going, no, he's an addict, he's a drunkard, he can't give up the drink. And there was a bit of a debate on how they would depict the old man if they were film directors and they had to do a casting with local actors or American actors for that matter. So a lot of talking, and they don't even realize how much of the language of poetry they are relying on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You could always, just had an idea, you could also look at other songs that depict old men and have a look at how in the culture old men are depicted, or old women. Are there any songs that depict old women, and how are they depicted?
What we did was compare it to tangos that depict bars. We don't normally have piano bars except in hotels, which are international, of course. But they compared it to local songs on cafes, and there are lots, particularly in tango. And one of them even interviewed his grandfather, because he said he'd never been into one of those cafes, which are quite traditional. But he asked his grandfather how he would spend time, whether there would be women in the bar or not. And that's something I mentioned in that plenary at IATEFL. I mentioned his work and his interview to his grandfather. And he interviewed him in Spanish, but his grandfather spoke with a very strong Italian accent. And he found it very hard to summarize this into English. So it was a great summary and translation task, another mediation.
Yes. And your suggested activity reminds me of a song that I used to use in the classroom quite a lot, which is Bobby Gentry's The Ode to Billy Joe.
Ah, yes.
Don't know if you've ever used that one.
No, I haven't.
And I think the idea of using songs that are stories as well. And in this one, the narrator and Billy Joe throw something off the Tallahatchie Bridge. And so it's always kind of interesting. What are they throwing off the Tallahatchie Bridge? Which I think was never revealed by Bobby Gentry. And so it's quite interesting. I always remember that that song has been covered by more recent artists as well. So it wasn't the fact that it was just a 1960s song, because it was then covered by, for example, Sinead O'Connor, etc. So you were able to I was able to use sort of more contemporary versions of it, and actually playing different versions of the song gives a whole different outlook for the students as well about how they interpret the lyrics.
Because there are different emotions being communicated. And we can go all the way back to Wolfgang Iser and his idea of gaps of indeterminacy, making a text rich and allowing the reader to come into the text and appropriate it. And that is another thing about creative texts as a whole, even film texts. How do you make it your own? And it's because there are gaps that allow you to come in. I remember using Julius Caesar by Shakespeare in that sense. There's this scene where Portia, Brutus's wife, notices that there's something going on and says, well, okay, tell me what's been going on. And he, of course, tries to protect her. It's a secret that they're going to try and assassinate the future emperor, and you're not going to say that to anyone so easily. And he says that he won't. And so she says, not more, but so. Then Portia is your harlot, not your wife. So I'm not your wife, I'm a kind of prostitute if you cannot trust me. That's a very strong thing to say to a husband. And then in the next scene, we see her going up and down the stage, worried, sending messengers to find out how my lord is doing. What's happened in between? Shakespeare leaves that gap. And what actors tell you is, as an actor, you must know what happened in between. Because if not, how do you play the next scene? But we readers and viewers don't know. And so that's a fabulous gap. And I asked my students to write that scene and perform it as if it was a contemporary scene. Portia was using her mobile, WhatsApping or frantically to somebody at the Capitol, trying to find out, etc., etc. At the end of all those role plays, I asked them, why is it that in all your performances, Portia is such an independent, strong woman? And they said, because in the play, and they started quoting from Shakespeare, the instances in which they thought that was the way Portia would be portrayed. So I said, okay, now you're ready to write your essay for AS level on how Portia is portrayed in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. If I had given them that task, and this was a literature class, not a language class, if I had given them that task, they would have found it boring, maybe difficult. Now they could write it in 10 minutes because they'd entered those gaps. They'd lived them in their own bodies as an actor would do. And that was fantastic. Was there a lot of language learning? Indeed, there was. Some of them were trying to even imitate an Elizabethan style, and they joked a lot about it. But they became very much aware of the thee, thou, thine kind of thing in the text because they were playing with it. I think that is the main thing. Never forget that there's something we can play with in the classroom in the best sense of the word. And after all, it was a play that we played with.
Of course, yes, that's really interesting. I think that idea of trying to ask the students or the teachers to connect the text that may be, in the case of the Shakespeare play you mentioned, written such a long time ago, with their own experience and the modern day, I think is a really clever thing to do, isn't it? To sort of make those connections and try to update it and get away from the kind of setting or the historical background of it to look at the actual feelings and emotions and of what is conveyed in the text is really interesting. Have you got any other examples of how you've done that, Claudia?
Oh, we do it all the time with Shakespeare, but never forgetting to analyze the context of production as well. Because if not, as we were saying when we were talking about cancellation culture, we lose sight of, how the writer might have been influenced or constrained by events that have changed completely for us, or even by conceptions of the world. For instance, going back to The Tempest, which I mentioned before, which I've even used at A1 level using an Oxford Dominoes reader, where the illustrations do most of the language work for you. One of the possible readings of that play is that Prospero, the guy who's on that island in The Tempest, is a kind of colonizer, a settler, a European imperialist who dominates Caliban, who can represent the locals, the Aborigine or the American original peoples. And that's a possibility. And it's been done. It's been done in film. It's been done in the theater. We can even find examples of that. But then what was Shakespeare's context? Can we ask him to have a 21st century way of looking at the spread of the British Empire? That in itself is an interesting exercise in critical thinking, not putting into the author's mouth what you believe it means now, but noticing the difference. And then, yes, appropriating it and changing it. I know that there are lots of people who hate it when directors change the text to make it contemporary. I think Shakespeare would have been happy, but that's my opinion. And I rather enjoy it when I see, I don't know, Romeo and Juliet without a balcony in the swimming pool. You remember the Leonardo DiCaprio performance. But I don't think everybody needs to agree. But it's just that only asking the question, how would this apply here now? And I insist here. So I remember attending a translation symposium here in Buenos Aires, where there was a translator of Othello who had translated it into Arabic. But she said the language was not the problem. The thing is that the performance she was translating it for was going to be carried out in Afghanistan, and her audience would be all male and probably Talibans. How could she persuade her audience, she asked, that this was a tragedy, that it was wrong to kill Desdemona on a suspicion of adultery, when they would have thought this was even legal today? So how important is the reception context to understand our work? I'll never forget how moved she was by the task she was given. And she said the impossible task was not translating the words, was translating what I thought would have been the spirit of the play, where evidently Othello ends up killing himself because he understands that what he's done is horrifying. Is it? For every audience, we would think it is. And that's why I go back to my tango. I called that plenary, I remember, outside looking in, because that's what the tango says. There's a child looking through the window of a cafe, hoping one day he will grow up and will be able to get in. And he does eventually. But the point is, I can't feel identified with that because no woman would have gone in. Not at that time. Now, definitely, I do all the time. I'm really working in those bars, and I love traditional bars, and nobody would find that strange at all. But things have changed. So how important is it to appropriate the text, but at the same time, read and find out, especially if you're a translator or if you're a communicator of any kind, a theater director, a teacher, how important is it to become aware of the context?
Yeah. Context is everything, isn't it, really? And how context has changed really reflects how you should maybe look at the text, the original text, and to try and use that as a starting point, perhaps, for discussion.
Yeah. If you think of the Bermuda pamphlets, for example, which were what originated, they say, The Tempest. How much do we know about the Bermudas, and how much do we know about the Bermuda Triangle? And did we know that there had been this wreck, this wreckage, and that the mariners were found, and then they didn't want to go back? Why wouldn't they want to go back? There's even a kind of historical gossip about it that they may find interesting, those who are more interested in the informative texts, let's say. So it all depends as well on, as we said at the beginning, on who you're teaching what for. Never forget your objectives. Sometimes the objective may be fun. You've noticed your students are under a lot of pressure for some reason, or things are not going well in the context. And so how about using a text for relaxing language fun? That's also a good reason. If that's your objective, why not?
Yeah, definitely. Claudia, I'm going to wrap things up now. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. It's fascinating to hear you talk about your use of literature for all of these reasons, and your experience as a teacher educator. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing that with you.
And thanks to whoever is listening. I hope they find this interesting. And thank you for this opportunity, Graham.
Pleasure.
At Bloomsbury Education, we're passionate about supporting teachers with high-quality professional development books from leading experts. Whether you're navigating your first crucial years as an early career teacher, or a more experienced teacher looking to refresh your practice or take a step up into leadership, our award-winning books are here to help. We publish practical books to support teaching across primary and secondary, from the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design. Visit the Bloomsbury Education website at bloomsbury.com/education to find out more, and use code BLOOMTTR24 to save 20% on all education titles. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
I've always considered myself to be a caring head teacher who acts sensitively to support staff mental health. But what I found increasingly difficult was managing the negative impact on staff mental health when resolving issues related to their employment or daily work. Heartfelt Leadership has been developed by Teachwell Toolkit as a handbook to support head teachers to overcome the challenges of school improvement while supporting staff well-being. We know that difficult conversations can quickly turn into conflict if procedures are not fully transparent, understood and followed. Our handbook takes you through step-by-step processes while maintaining mutual respect, avoiding conflict and finding solutions.
So that brings us to the end of the Twilight Show today. Thank you so much to my special guest, Claudia Ferradas, and to everyone who listened in live. Thank you too if you are listening back to the recording. And remember, there are lots more live shows all week on Teachers Talk Radio. And there is also an extensive archive of recorded shows too. I recommend that you check them out. I will be back next Saturday at 5 p.m. UK time, the usual time for the Twilight Show, with another guest. Until then, bye for now.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.
At Bloomsbury Education, we're passionate about supporting teachers with high-quality professional development books from leading experts. Whether you're navigating your first crucial years as an early career teacher or a more experienced teacher looking to refresh your practice or take a step up into leadership, our award-winning books are here to help. We publish practical books to support teaching across primary and secondary, from the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design. Visit the Bloomsbury Education website at bloomsbury.com/education to find out more and use code BLOOMTTR24 to save 20% on all education titles. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
I've always considered myself to be a caring head teacher who acts sensitively to support staff mental health. But what I found increasingly difficult was managing the negative impact on staff mental health when resolving issues related to their employment or daily work. Heartfelt Leadership has been developed by Teachwell Toolkit as a handbook to support head teachers to overcome the challenges of school improvement while supporting staff well-being. We know that difficult conversations can quickly turn into conflict if procedures are not fully transparent, understood and followed. Our handbook takes you through step-by-step processes while maintaining mutual respect, avoiding conflict and finding solutions.